The rain hammered against the cottage windows with relentless fury, each droplet carrying the weight of 1,000 secrets. Margaret pressed her trembling hand against the cold glass, watching the storm rage across the English countryside. She never imagined that one decision made in the depths of winter would forever change the course of her life. What drives someone to risk everything for a stranger? What invisible force compels us to choose compassion over safety, love over loyalty? Tonight I want to share with you a story that challenges everything we think we know about wartime, about enemies, and about the human heart's capacity to find light in the darkest of times. This is not just another war story. This is the tale of Margaret Ashford, a young British woman whose act of mercy toward a wounded enemy soldier would ignite a forbidden love affair that defied nations, transcended boundaries, and ultimately demanded the ultimate sacrifice. By the end of this story, you will understand why sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the one pointing a gun at you, but the one who makes you question everything you believed about right and wrong. I have spent months researching this extraordinary account, diving deep into personal letters, diary entries, and testimonies that have remained hidden for decades. What I discovered will challenge your assumptions about love during wartime and force you to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of human connection. Picture England in 1943. The war has been raging for nearly 4 years, and the British people have endured countless nights of bombing, raids, rationing, and the constant fear of invasion. Every German uniform represents death, destruction, and the enemy that threatens to destroy everything they hold dear. In this world of absolute moral certainty, there should be no room for doubt, no space for compassion toward those who wear the swastika. Margaret Ashford lived in this world of black and white certainties. Born into a family of proud English heritage, she had been raised to believe in duty, honor, and unwavering loyalty to crown and country. Her father had served in the Great War, her brother was fighting somewhere in North Africa, and she herself worked tirelessly for the war effort, tending to wounded British soldiers at the local hospital. The Ashford family manor had stood for generations, its walls bearing witness to centuries of English history. Every portrait hanging in the grand hallway told a story of service, sacrifice, and steadfast devotion to king and country. Margaret had been taught from childhood that some lines must never be crossed, some boundaries must never be breached, but war has a way of shattering even the most deeply held convictions. On that fateful February night, as the snow fell thick and heavy across the Yorkshire countryside, Margaret heard something that would change everything. She was returning home from her evening shift at the hospital when she noticed footprints in the snow leading toward the old gardener's cottage on the far edge of their property. The cottage had been abandoned for months, ever since old Thomas had passed away the previous autumn. Her heart pounded as she followed the tracks, each step taking her closer to a discovery that would turn her world upside down. The footprints were too large to belong to any of the estate workers, too deliberate to belong to a vagrant seeking shelter. As she approached the cottage, she could see a faint light flickering through the cracked window. Margaret knew she should turn back. She should alert the authorities immediately. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to maintain the safe distance between herself and whatever danger lurked inside that cottage. But something deeper, something she could not name, compelled her to move forward. When she pushed open the creaking door, her breath caught in her throat. There, huddled in the corner beside a makeshift fire, was a man in a tattered German uniform. His face was pale with exhaustion and pain, his left shoulder dark with dried blood. Their eyes met across the small room, and in that moment, Margaret felt the foundations of her world begin to crack. He was not the monster she had been taught to expect. He was not the embodiment of evil that propaganda posters had burned into her mind. He was simply a young man, perhaps her own age, wounded and alone, thousands of miles from home. His eyes held no malice, no threat. Instead, she saw something that shook her to her core. She saw fear, vulnerability, and a desperate hope for human kindness. The man tried to stand, wincing with pain as he struggled to his feet. In broken English, he whispered words that would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. He did not demand help. He did not threaten her. Instead, he simply asked, with the dignity of someone who expected nothing but hoped for everything, if she might spare him shelter until dawn. Margaret stood frozen at the threshold, caught between duty and compassion, between the safe certainty of her convictions and the terrifying unknown of human empathy. Every fiber of her being told her to run, to summon help, to do what any loyal British citizen would do when confronted with an enemy soldier. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that shattered her carefully constructed worldview. She saw her brother's face on that Christmas morning when he had fallen from his horse and scraped his knee. She saw her father's expression when he returned from France, broken and haunted by memories he would never share. She saw, in this enemy's face, the universal language of human suffering. The decision she made in that moment would set in motion a chain of events that would test the very limits of love, loyalty, and sacrifice. It would force her to confront questions that had no easy answers. Can love exist between enemies? Is it possible to separate the person from the uniform they wear? And what price are we willing to pay for following our hearts when our hearts lead us into forbidden territory? Margaret's choice that night was not made from political conviction or calculated rebellion. It was made from something far more dangerous and far more powerful. It was made from the simple recognition of shared humanity in the face of unimaginable circumstances. As she stepped across the threshold of that cottage, Margaret Ashford stepped across the threshold of her former life. Behind her lay the safety of unquestioned loyalty, the comfort of clear moral boundaries, and the security of a world where enemies and allies were easily distinguished. Ahead of her lay a path fraught with danger, doubt, and the kind of love that would demand everything she had to give. The wounded German soldier who would later tell her his name was Hans watched her approach with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He had escaped from a prisoner of war camp 3 days earlier, surviving on nothing but determination and the desperate hope of reaching neutral territory. He had not expected kindness from his enemies. He had not expected mercy from those he had been taught to view as adversaries. But here was this young Englishwoman, this daughter of the very people he had been trained to fight against, offering him the one thing he needed most, the recognition that he was, above all else, a human being deserving of compassion. Margaret moved with quiet efficiency, her medical training taking over as she assessed his injuries. The bullet wound in his shoulder was not life-threatening, but it needed attention. She found herself speaking softly, reassuringly, as she had done countless times with wounded soldiers at the hospital. The only difference was that this time she was treating the enemy. As she cleaned and bandaged his wound, their conversation began hesitantly, cautiously. He told her of his home in Bavaria, of the mountains where he had grown up, of the family he hoped to see again someday. She found herself sharing stories of her own life, of the Yorkshire countryside she loved, of the brother fighting somewhere in the desert of North Africa. With each word exchanged, the boundaries between enemy and ally began to blur. With each moment of shared humanity, the propaganda and hatred that had defined their understanding of each other began to crumble. They were no longer British and German, Allied and Axis. They were simply two young people, caught in the madness of a war neither had chosen, finding in each other a respite from the loneliness and fear that had become their constant companions. What happened next would challenge everything they had been taught about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of courage in the face of impossible choices. As the hours passed in that dimly lit cottage, something profound began to unfold between Margaret and the man who had introduced himself as Hans Miller. The storm outside seemed to mirror the tempest brewing within her heart as she found herself drawn to this stranger who should have been her sworn enemy. Hans spoke of his life before the war with a gentleness that contradicted everything she had been told about German soldiers. He had been studying literature at university, dreaming of becoming a teacher. He recited lines of poetry in his native tongue, his voice soft and melodic in the flickering firelight. Margaret found herself captivated, not just by his words, but by the passion with which he spoke of books, of learning, of the simple joys that war had stolen from so many. She told him about her own dreams, about the art history degree she had been pursuing before the war changed everything. They discovered a shared love of Renaissance paintings, of quiet mornings spent reading, of the way sunlight filters through cathedral windows. In that cottage, surrounded by the chaos of war, they created a small sanctuary where nationality meant nothing and human connection meant everything. The danger of their situation became starkly apparent as dawn approached. Margaret knew the groundskeeper would be making his rounds soon, and the thought of Hans being discovered filled her with a terror she had never experienced before. But it was not the fear of being caught harboring an enemy that consumed her thoughts. It was the fear of losing this unexpected connection, this glimpse of something beautiful in a world gone mad. Hans saw the worry in her eyes and took her hand gently in his own. His touch was warm, reassuring, and completely at odds with the image of the cold, ruthless enemy she had carried in her mind for so long. He promised her that he would leave before anyone could find him, that he would not allow her kindness to bring harm upon her or her family. But Margaret surprised herself with her response. Instead of relief, she felt a crushing disappointment at the thought of his departure. In the space of a few hours, this man had awakened something within her that she had never known existed. She found herself making a decision that would have seemed impossible just one day earlier. She told Hans about the network of abandoned tunnels that ran beneath the estate, remnants of a bygone era when smugglers had used them to move contraband inland from the coast. She knew these passages better than anyone, having explored them as a child against her parents' wishes. If he was willing to trust her, she could hide him there until it was safe for him to continue his journey. The risk was enormous. Discovery would mean not just her own ruin, but the destruction of her entire family's reputation. Her father would be branded a traitor, her mother ostracized from the community she had served faithfully for decades. The Ashford name, which had stood for honor and loyalty for generations, would be forever tainted by her choice. Yet as she looked into Hans's eyes, Margaret realized that some risks were worth taking. Some. Connections transcend the artificial boundaries that war creates between people. Some forms of love emerge not despite our differences, but because of our shared humanity in the face of unimaginable circumstances. Hans initially refused her offer, unwilling to place her in such danger for his sake. He spoke of his own family, of the shame they would feel if they knew he had brought harm to an innocent woman who had shown him nothing but kindness. But Margaret persisted, and eventually he agreed to let her help him, moved by her determination and touched by her willingness to sacrifice so much for someone she barely knew. Together they made their way through the pre-dawn darkness to the hidden entrance of the tunnel system. Margaret led him through passages she had not traversed in years, her childhood memories guiding them through the labyrinthine network that honeycombed the ground beneath her family's estate. The chamber where she finally brought him was dry and reasonably comfortable, with stone walls that had stood for centuries and a natural ventilation system that ensured fresh air. She had played here as a girl, imagining herself as a princess in a fairy tale castle. Now, it would serve as a hiding place for the man who was rapidly becoming something far more significant to her than she dared admit. Margaret established a routine that allowed her to care for Hans without arousing suspicion from the household staff. She would bring him food and medical supplies during her supposed walks around the estate, timing her visits to coincide with moments when she was least likely to be observed or missed. Their conversations during these clandestine meetings revealed depths to both of their characters that might never have emerged under normal circumstances. Hans told her about the internal conflict he experienced as a soldier, about the orders he had been given that contradicted his moral compass, about the guilt he carried for actions taken in the name of duty. Margaret shared her own struggles with the expectations placed upon her as a woman of her social standing, about the pressure to marry appropriately and settle into a life of quiet domesticity, while her heart yearned for something more meaningful, more authentic. They found in each other not just attraction, but understanding. They discovered that the arbitrary lines drawn by nations and ideologies could not diminish the fundamental human need for connection, for someone who sees and appreciates who we truly are beneath the roles society assigns us. As days turned into weeks, their relationship deepened in ways that both thrilled and terrified them. What had begun as an act of mercy had evolved into something that challenged every assumption they had held about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of courage. Hans taught Margaret phrases in German, and she helped him improve his English. They shared stories from their childhoods, dreams they had harbored before the war, fears they had never voiced to another living soul. In that hidden chamber beneath the Yorkshire countryside, they created a world apart from the madness raging above, a place where their hearts could speak freely without the constraints of nationality or politics. But love, born in secrecy, carries its own unique burdens. Every moment of happiness was shadowed by the knowledge that discovery could come at any time. Every touch was precious because it might be their last. Every word spoken was treasured because tomorrow might bring separation or worse. Margaret began to notice changes in herself that both excited and alarmed her. She found herself taking greater risks to spend time with Hans, staying away from the house longer than was prudent, making excuses that grew increasingly elaborate. The other members of the household began to comment on her distraction, her tendency to smile at inappropriate moments, her apparent preoccupation with something they could not identify. Her mother, particularly observant when it came to her daughter's moods and behaviors, began to ask gentle but probing questions about Margaret's daily activities. The close-knit community in which they lived meant that any unusual behavior was quickly noticed and discussed, making Margaret's secret all the more dangerous to maintain. Meanwhile, Hans struggled with his own internal conflicts. His feelings for Margaret had grown far beyond gratitude for her initial kindness. He found himself falling deeply in love with this remarkable woman who had risked everything to show compassion to a stranger. But he was also acutely aware that his presence in her life placed her in constant danger. The war continued to rage around them, bringing fresh reminders daily of the impossible situation they had created for themselves. News of battles, casualty reports, and propaganda broadcasts served as constant reminders that they were supposed to be enemies, that their love was a betrayal of everything their respective countries expected from them. Yet, in quiet moments when Margaret would read to him by candlelight or when they would simply sit together in comfortable silence, the war seemed like a distant nightmare from which they might someday awaken. In those precious hours, they were simply two people who had found in each other something worth protecting, something worth fighting for, even if that fight meant standing against the entire world. The intensity of their connection continued to grow, fed by the knowledge that each day together might be their last. Each conversation might be their final opportunity to share their thoughts and feelings. This urgency gave their relationship a depth and intensity that might have taken years to develop under normal circumstances. But normal circumstances were a luxury they would never enjoy, and the challenges facing them were about to become far more complex than either of them could have imagined. The weight of their secret grew heavier with each passing day. Margaret found herself living two completely different lives, each demanding its own set of loyalties, its own version of truth. During the daylight hours, she played the role of the dutiful English daughter, attending church services where prayers were offered for British victory, participating in community meetings where strategies for supporting the war effort were discussed, and maintaining the facade of unwavering patriotism that her family and friends expected. But as evening shadows lengthened across the estate, she would transform into someone else entirely. She became a woman, willing to risk everything for a love that defied every convention of her time, every expectation of her society. The person who emerged in those underground chambers was more authentic, more alive, more herself than she had ever been in the world above. Hans began to recover his strength, his shoulder healing under Margaret's careful attention. As his physical condition improved, so did his ability to move about the tunnel system, to explore the hidden passages that had become his sanctuary and his prison. He discovered chambers filled with remnants of the estate's history, storage rooms containing artifacts from generations past, forgotten corners where time seemed to have stopped. In one such room, he found an old trunk containing books that had belonged to Margaret's grandfather, volumes of poetry and philosophy that had been stored away and forgotten. When Margaret discovered his find, she was amazed to learn that her grandfather had been a scholar of German literature, that he had owned first editions of works by Goethe and Schiller, writers whose words Hans had memorized during his university years. This discovery created another bridge between their two worlds, another reminder that the divisions between their nations were far more recent than the connections that bound all of humanity together. They spent hours discussing the meanings hidden within ancient verses, debating the philosophical questions that had occupied great minds for centuries, finding in literature a common language that transcended the barriers of war. Margaret began bringing him writing materials, and Hans started to document their time together, not as a record of events, but as an exploration of the emotions and insights that their relationship had awakened within him. He wrote about the way Margaret's face changed when she laughed, about the gentle strength of her hands as she tended his wounds, about the courage she displayed in choosing love over safety. She, in turn, began to sketch him during their quiet moments together. Her artistic training, dormant since the war began, resurged with new purpose as she attempted to capture not just his physical appearance, but the essence of who he was beneath the uniform that had once defined him as her enemy. Her drawings revealed a man of sensitivity and intelligence, someone whose eyes held depths of experience and wisdom that belied his young age. These creative exchanges became another form of intimacy between them, a way of preserving moments that they knew were precious beyond measure. Each poem Hans wrote, each sketch Margaret completed, was a small act of rebellion against the forces that sought to keep them apart, a declaration that their love deserved to be remembered and honored, regardless of the circumstances that had brought it into being. But their private world could not remain isolated from the larger conflicts raging beyond the estate's boundaries. News reached the village that German prisoners had escaped from a camp nearly 50 miles away, that search parties were being organized to track down the fugitives. Margaret felt her blood turn to ice as she realized that Hans might be among those being hunted, that their sanctuary might soon be discovered. The knowledge that danger was closing in around them added a new urgency to their time together. Their conversations became more intense, more honest, as they faced the possibility that their idyllic existence beneath the Yorkshire countryside might soon come to an end. They spoke about the future with a desperate hope that neither quite believed, making plans for a life together after the war that seemed increasingly impossible with each passing day. Hans told Margaret about his family's farm in Bavaria, about the mountains that surrounded his childhood home, about the life he had imagined for himself before the world descended into chaos. He painted pictures with his words of quiet mornings spent tending to the land, of evenings filled with music and laughter, of a simple existence far removed from the complexities and compromises that war demanded. Margaret shared her own dreams of traveling, of seeing the art treasures of Europe that she had only studied in books, of experiencing different cultures and meeting people whose perspectives might broaden her understanding of the world. She had never spoken these ambitions aloud before, having been raised to expect a life of domestic contentment within the confines of English society. Together, they created elaborate fantasies of a world where their love would not be seen as betrayal, where they could walk openly together through the streets of any city, where their children could grow up knowing both sides of their heritage without shame or secrecy. These dreams sustained them through the darkest moments of doubt and fear, providing hope when the reality of their situation seemed too overwhelming to bear. The physical aspects of their relationship had developed gradually, naturally, without the awkwardness that might have characterized such intimacy under normal circumstances. The life and death nature of their situation had stripped away many of the social conventions that typically governed relationships between unmarried people of their class and background. When Hans held Margaret in his arms, when she traced the scars that marked his experiences as a soldier, they were not thinking about propriety or reputation. They were simply two people finding comfort and connection in a world that had gone mad around them. Yet, even their most intimate moments were shadowed by the knowledge that they were living on borrowed time. Every kiss carried the weight of potential goodbye. Every whispered endearment might be the last they would ever share. This awareness gave their physical relationship an intensity and poignancy that might never have developed under ordinary circumstances. Margaret began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere of the estate that suggested their secret might not be as secure as they had believed. The groundskeeper mentioned finding disturbances in areas where he was certain no authorized person should have been walking. Cook complained that food supplies were disappearing faster than expected, despite her careful rationing. The housekeeper reported strange sounds coming from unused portions of the house during the night hours. Each of these observations, innocent in isolation, began to form a pattern that made Margaret increasingly nervous about their safety. She realized that maintaining Hans's presence on the estate was becoming more difficult and more dangerous with each day that passed. The longer he remained hidden in the tunnels, the greater the likelihood that someone would eventually discover evidence of his presence. The internal conflict this recognition created was almost unbearable. Margaret knew that the logical, responsible course of action would be to help Hans continue his journey toward neutral territory as quickly as possible. Every day, he remained increased the risk not just to herself, but to her entire family, to the estate workers who depended on the Ashfords for their livelihood, to the community that trusted in their loyalty and discretion. But the thought of losing Hans, of watching him disappear into the darkness beyond the estate's boundaries, filled her with a grief so profound that she could barely function during the daylight hours when such thoughts occupied her mind. She had never experienced anything like the connection she felt with this man, had never imagined that love could be so consuming, so all-encompassing, so capable of making everything else in life seem secondary and unimportant. Hans struggled with similar conflicts, torn between his desire to remain with Margaret and his awareness of the danger his presence created for her. He had grown to love not just her personally, but everything she represented about courage, compassion, and the capacity of the human heart to transcend the artificial boundaries that war creates between people. The thought of bringing harm to someone so precious to him was almost as unbearable as the prospect of leaving her behind. Their discussions about his departure became increasingly emotional and increasingly frequent as external pressures mounted. They would plan his route, discuss the safest times for travel, identify contacts who might be able to help him reach neutral territory. But each planning session would inevitably dissolve into expressions of love and desperate wishes that circumstances could be different, that they could find a way to remain together without endangering everyone and everything Margaret held dear. The approaching crisis forced them both to confront questions that had no easy answers. How much are we willing to sacrifice for love? At what point does personal happiness become selfish when it threatens the welfare of others? Can love justify the risks we ask others to bear for our choices? These were not abstract philosophical questions for Margaret and Hans. They were immediate, practical dilemmas that demanded decisions with life and death consequences. The intensity of their situation was about to reach a breaking point, that would test not just their love for each other, but their understanding of honor, duty, and the true meaning of courage in the face of impossible choices. As winter began to give way to the first hints of spring, Margaret received news that would forever alter the delicate balance they had managed to maintain. Her brother James was coming home on leave, arriving within the week, for a brief respite from his service in North Africa. His visit would bring additional scrutiny to every corner of the estate, additional eyes and ears that might detect signs of Hans's presence. James had always been protective of his sister, observant of her moods and behaviors in ways that their parents sometimes missed. His soldier's training would make him particularly alert to anything unusual, anything that might suggest danger or deception within his family's home. Margaret realized that maintaining her secret would become exponentially more difficult with her brother in residence. The news of James's impending arrival created a new urgency in Margaret's relationship with Hans. They both understood that this development might force the decision they had been avoiding, that the time for difficult choices was rapidly approaching. The sanctuary they had created beneath the Yorkshire countryside was about to be tested in ways that neither of them had anticipated when their forbidden love first began to bloom in the depths of a winter storm. The weight of James's impending arrival pressed down on Margaret like a physical burden she could no longer ignore. She found herself unable to sleep, pacing the corridors of the manor house in the early morning hours, her mind racing through countless scenarios that all seemed to end in disaster. How could she explain her frequent absences, her distracted demeanor, the way her eyes seemed to hold secrets that grew heavier with each passing day? Hans sensed her increasing anxiety during their meetings in the hidden chamber. He watched the worry lines deepen around her eyes, observed how her hands trembled slightly when she thought he was not looking. The woman who had shown such remarkable courage in choosing to help him was now being consumed by the impossible situation their love had created. During one of their evening encounters, Hans made a decision that would demonstrate the depth of his feelings for Margaret and his understanding of the sacrifice she had made for him. He told her that he would leave before her brother arrived, that he could not bear to watch her suffer under the strain of maintaining their secret any longer. The pain in his voice as he spoke these words revealed how much this choice cost him, but his determination was absolute. Margaret's response surprised them both with its intensity. She refused to accept his decision, declaring that she would rather face discovery than lose him to the uncertainty of his continued flight. Her words came from a place of desperation and love that transcended rational thought, from a heart that had found its other half in the most unlikely of circumstances. Their argument that night was passionate and heartbreaking, filled with declarations of love and expressions of fear that neither had voiced before. Hans spoke of his dreams of taking her away from all of this, of finding some neutral corner of the world where they could build a life together free from the shadows of war and national hatred. Margaret responded with her own fantasies of escape, of abandoning everything she had ever known for the chance to be with the man who had awakened her heart to possibilities she had never imagined. But even as they spoke of running away together, both understood the reality of their situation. Margaret could not simply disappear without bringing shame and suspicion upon her family. Her absence would raise questions that could lead investigators directly to Hans, endangering not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone who had unknowingly aided in concealing his presence. Hans, meanwhile, carried the burden of his military oath and the knowledge that his capture would result not just in his own imprisonment or execution, but in severe consequences for Margaret. The German military's treatment of those who aided escaped prisoners was notoriously harsh, and the British authorities would show little mercy to someone caught harboring an enemy soldier, regardless of her motivations. The complexity of their dilemma seemed to increase with each conversation, each moment of intimacy that made the thought of separation more unbearable. They had created something beautiful and profound in the depths of the earth beneath her family's estate. But that beauty was built on foundations that could not support the weight of the world above. As James's arrival drew closer, Margaret began to make subtle preparations that she hoped would minimize the risk of discovery. She altered her daily routines, finding new excuses for her absences that would seem natural and unremarkable to her brother. She moved supplies to different locations within the tunnel system, ensuring that Hans would have everything he needed even if her ability to visit him became restricted. The night before James was scheduled to arrive, Margaret and Hans held each other with a desperation that spoke volumes about their fear of what the coming days might bring. They made love with an urgency that was both beautiful and tragic, knowing that this might be their last opportunity for such intimacy. That tomorrow would bring new dangers and new obstacles to their already impossible relationship. Hans whispered promises in her ear, vows that he would find a way back to her after the war, declarations that no distance or time could diminish what they had found together. Margaret responded with her own pledges, assertions that she would wait for him no matter how long it took, assurances that their love was stronger than any force that might seek to tear them apart. But even as they spoke these words of hope and commitment, both understood that they were making promises that circumstances might not allow them to keep. War had a way of destroying even the strongest bonds, of separating lovers whose only crime was finding each other at the wrong moment in history. The morning of James's arrival dawned gray and cold, with a bitter wind that seemed to carry hints of the challenges ahead. Margaret watched from her bedroom window as her brother's military transport approached the manor, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy at seeing him again and terror at what his presence might mean for her secret life with Hans. James Ashford stepped out of the vehicle looking every inch the seasoned soldier he had become. Months of desert warfare had tanned his skin and hardened his features, but his eyes still held the warmth and affection that Margaret remembered from their childhood. As he embraced her on the front steps of the manor, she felt the full weight of her deception, the knowledge that she was welcoming home a brother who would be horrified by the choices she had made in his absence. The reunion dinner that evening was a bittersweet affair for Margaret. Her parents beamed with pride as James recounted sanitized versions of his experiences in North Africa, carefully edited tales that revealed his courage without dwelling too heavily on the horrors he had witnessed. Margaret found herself studying her brother's face, searching for signs of how the war had changed him, wondering if he would be able to understand her own transformation if he ever learned the truth. James, for his part, was immediately aware that something had changed in his sister during his absence. The Margaret he remembered had been spirited but conventional, passionate about her studies and her artistic pursuits, but always careful to maintain the boundaries that their upbringing had established. The woman who sat across from him at dinner seemed different somehow, more alive in some ways, but also carrying burdens that she was clearly reluctant to share. His soldier's instincts, honed by months of combat and survival, detected an undercurrent of tension in the household that he could not immediately identify. Nothing was obviously wrong, but there were subtle signs that suggested all was not as peaceful as it appeared on the surface. His sister's distraction, the way her eyes seemed to be focused on something beyond the immediate conversation, the slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was watching. After dinner, James attempted to engage Margaret in private conversation, hoping to discover what was troubling her. His approach was gentle but persistent, the concerned questioning of a brother who sensed that his sister was in some kind of distress. Margaret deflected his inquiries with skill born of weeks of practice, but she could tell that her evasions were not entirely convincing. The first few days of James's visit passed in a state of carefully maintained normalcy that exhausted Margaret both physically and emotionally. She found opportunities to visit Hans, but these meetings were necessarily brief and fraught with anxiety. The knowledge that her brother was sleeping just floors above their secret chamber added a layer of danger that made every moment together feel stolen and precarious. Hans could see the toll that maintaining her double life was taking on Margaret. The woman who had shown such strength and determination in choosing to help him was being slowly consumed by the stress of keeping their secret while maintaining normal relationships with her family. He began to seriously consider leaving despite her protests, recognizing that his presence was causing her suffering that she was too generous to acknowledge. Their conversations during this period took on a different quality, becoming more focused on practical matters and future possibilities rather than the romantic exchanges that had characterized their earlier time together. They discussed routes he might take to reach neutral territory, contacts who might be able to provide assistance, ways of communicating if separation became inevitable. But even these practical discussions were suffused with emotion, with unspoken acknowledgments of what they might be losing. Every plan they made for his departure felt like another small death, another step toward a future that neither of them wanted to contemplate but both increasingly understood might be unavoidable. James's military experience made him naturally observant, and he began to notice small details that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested something unusual was occurring within the household. Food disappeared from the kitchen in quantities that seemed excessive for normal consumption. Candles and lamp oil were being used at rates that did not correspond to the family's typical evening activities. There were sounds in the night that seemed to emanate from unused portions of the house. Most troubling of all was his sister's behavior. Margaret had always been close to him, sharing her thoughts and concerns with the openness that characterized their sibling relationship. But now, she seemed guarded, careful in ways that suggested she was hiding something significant. Her explanations for her daily activities were detailed but somehow hollow, as if she were reciting prepared stories rather than sharing genuine experiences. James's growing suspicions created a new dynamic in the household that Margaret could feel but could not openly address. Her brother's questions became more probing, his observation more systematic, his presence more intrusive in ways that made maintaining her secret increasingly difficult. She found herself trapped between her love for Hans and her love for her family, between her desire to protect the man who had become everything to her and her need to preserve the relationships that had defined her entire life. The pressure was building toward a confrontation that would force all of the hidden truths to the surface, that would require choices that none of them were prepared to make. Margaret could sense that her carefully constructed double life was becoming unsustainable, that the foundations of deception upon which her happiness rested were beginning to crumble. Hans, meanwhile, struggled with his own internal conflicts as he watched the woman he loved suffer under the weight of maintaining their secret. His presence had brought her joy and awakened her heart to new possibilities, but it had also placed her in a position where she was forced to deceive everyone she cared about. The knowledge that he was the source of her current anguish filled him with guilt that threatened to overwhelm his gratitude for her love and sacrifice. The situation reached a critical point one evening when James directly confronted Margaret about her recent behavior. His approach was loving but firm, the concerned intervention of a brother who sensed that his sister was in trouble and needed his help. He spoke of his willingness to support her regardless of what she might have done, of his understanding that wartime created pressures and situations that required difficult choices. Margaret found herself on the verge of confession, nearly overwhelmed by the relief that honesty might bring and the comfort of sharing her burden with someone who loved her unconditionally. But the knowledge of what such a revelation would mean for Hans held her back, kept her trapped in the web of deception that had become both her protection and her prison. Her refusal to confide in James created a rift between them that neither had experienced before. James felt hurt and frustrated by his sister's apparent lack of trust, while Margaret felt guilty about deceiving someone who had always been her closest confidant and strongest supporter. The emotional distance that developed between them added another layer of pain to Margaret's already overwhelming situation. The crisis that would force all of these tensions to the surface was approaching rapidly, driven by forces beyond any of their control and circumstances that would test every relationship, every loyalty, and every assumption they had made about love, duty, and the true meaning of courage. Duty and the true meaning of courage. The breaking point came on a fog-laden morning when James decided to conduct his own investigation of the estate grounds. His military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and every fiber of his being told him that something was amiss within the boundaries of his family's property. He had served long enough to recognize the signs of concealment, the subtle indicators that suggested someone was living in spaces where they should not be. Margaret watched from her bedroom window as her brother methodically examined areas of the estate that had previously gone unnoticed by the household staff. His movements were purposeful and systematic, the practiced reconnaissance of a soldier who understood how to uncover hidden truths. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that James was moving steadily toward the section of the grounds that concealed the tunnel entrances. She knew she had to act quickly. Making a hasty excuse to her mother about needing fresh air for her morning constitutional, Margaret hurried outside with the desperate hope of diverting her brother's attention away from the dangerous areas. But James had already discovered something that made her blood freeze in her veins. Fresh footprints in the soft earth near the old oak tree. Prints that were too large to belong to any of the estate workers and too recent to be explained by legitimate activity. James knelt beside the tracks, his experienced eye reading the story they told with the accuracy of someone who had learned to interpret such signs as a matter of survival. Margaret approached her brother with forced casualness, attempting to engage him in conversation that might distract him from his discoveries. But James had found additional evidence that confirmed his growing suspicions. Broken branches at shoulder height, disturbed undergrowth that suggested regular passage, small scraps of fabric caught on thorns that did not match the clothing worn by any authorized person on the estate. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred between the siblings. James's questions were direct and uncompromising, driven by his concern for Margaret's safety and his growing certainty that she was somehow involved in whatever clandestine activity was taking place on their family's property. His tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to command, but also the desperation of a brother who feared for his sister's welfare. Margaret's attempts at denial crumbled under the weight of evidence and her brother's relentless questioning. She could see in his eyes the moment when he moved from suspicion to certainty, when his military instincts confirmed what his heart had been reluctant to accept. His sister was harboring secrets that could destroy everything their family had built over generations. The revelation that followed was devastating in its implications. When Margaret finally admitted that she had been helping someone, James's immediate assumption was that she had become involved with some form of resistance activity, perhaps assisting British agents or supporting escaped Allied prisoners. His shock was profound when she revealed the true nature of her secret, when she told him about Hans and the impossible love that had grown between them in the hidden chambers beneath their ancestral home. James's initial reaction was one of disbelief so complete that he questioned whether his sister had suffered some form of mental breakdown. The idea that Margaret could have fallen in love with a German soldier, that she could have chosen to protect and hide someone who represented everything they had been fighting against, seemed so foreign to everything he knew about her character that he struggled to accept it as reality. But as Margaret continued her explanation, as she described the circumstances of their first meeting and the gradual development of their relationship, James began to recognize the sincerity in her voice, the genuine emotion that underscored every word she spoke. This was not the fantasy of someone who had lost touch with reality. This was the confession of someone who had made choices that defied convention, but emerged from the deepest convictions of her heart. The argument that erupted between them was fierce and painful, filled with accusations and justifications that neither had ever expected to voice. James spoke of duty and loyalty, of the sacrifices being made by thousands of young men who were dying to protect the very freedoms that Margaret was jeopardizing through her actions. He reminded her of their brother-in-arms who had fallen in North Africa, of the families destroyed by German bombs, of the moral clarity that should guide every British citizen during these dark times. Margaret responded with equal passion, speaking of the humanity she had discovered in Hans, of the poetry and philosophy that revealed depths of character that transcended national boundaries. She described the gentleness of his touch when he tended to her minor injuries, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of his family's farm in Bavaria, the profound conversations that had opened her mind to perspectives she had never considered. Their debate continued for hours, ranging across questions of morality, patriotism, and the nature of love itself. James argued that personal feelings could not justify betrayal of one's country, that individual happiness must be subordinated to the greater good of the war effort. Margaret countered that true patriotism sometimes required the courage to recognize the humanity in one's enemies, that the highest form of loyalty might be the refusal to let hatred consume one's capacity for compassion. As their discussion progressed, subtle changes began to occur in both siblings. James found himself forced to confront the complexity of moral questions he had previously seen in simpler terms. His sister's obvious sincerity and the depth of her feelings challenged his assumptions about the clear divisions between right and wrong that had guided his military service. Margaret, meanwhile, was compelled to articulate the foundations of her choices in ways she had never attempted before. Speaking to her brother forced her to examine her own motivations, to consider whether her actions truly emerged from noble impulses or whether she had simply been swept away by emotions that clouded her judgment. The conversation took a dramatic turn when James demanded to meet Hans personally. His request was motivated partly by curiosity and partly by the protective instinct that made him want to evaluate the man who had captured his sister's heart so completely. Margaret initially resisted, fearing what such a meeting might precipitate, but eventually agreed when James made it clear that his cooperation depended upon his ability to form his own judgment about the German soldier. Margaret's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of love and loyalty during humanity's darkest hours. Her choice to see beyond the uniform, to recognize shared humanity in her supposed enemy, challenges everything we believe about wartime morality. Perhaps the most dangerous battles are not fought on distant battlefields, but within our own hearts when we must choose between the safety of hatred and the courage of compassion.